As many of you know, I hope, she spent almost 19 years from, remind me of the dates.
1984, 2000.
That's right. Digiling in front of the White House in many different ways. I'll let you describe that. And probably spoke, how many people would you say you might have spoken with? I was asking Robin, and we were saying many millions that you had contact with. Who saw you there, but you spoke with maybe several, tens of thousands, okay. But I think you had an impact with those you spoke with. I know that. So recently, Ellen, along with Carol Berner, who's not able to be with us here, but is in Portland, Oregon at the moment, have been the chairs of the Disarm End Wars Issue Committee that now comprises Ellen, Robin Lloyd, and Barbara Nielsen, with Carol Berner in the background guiding. The last 2 years, Ellen has been on the road. The first year was traveling the West Coast, going to local branches and other organizations with Carol Berner, speaking about peace work and peace building. And this past year with Odile Huguenot-Haber of the Ann Arbor, Michigan branch, and co-program chair with Maureen Eckett along the East Coast, and maybe you'll tell us something about that. So Ellen is a wonderful traveling spokesperson and vigilant for peace.
Well, thank you. I see some very familiar faces from who have hosted me and my friends the last 2 years. Carol and I also did the East Coast last year, and it was the middle part of the country actually that I spent touring in the spring this year. And I've had a pretty, I've pretty much been saying the same things for a long time. I honed my talk down over the process of talking to thousands of people in front of the White House. And very briefly, there were a lot of wonderful adventures out there, and I am writing a book, and someday I'll do a book tour and I'll tell you all those stories. But today I want to talk about the fact that here we are at the 33rd, is it? 33rd Triennial Congress. That means 102 years that WILPF has been in existence, and all that time we've been working to get rid of war, and some people might say, yeah, look at what we got going on now. But then I would like to say that how much worse might it have been if we hadn't been working for war all this time, working against war all this time, because some things might have happened that haven't happened because we've spoken out and spoken our minds. When I began my vigil in front of the White House in 1984, joining the people who had been there for 3 years, I remember going to, getting very frustrated because I passionately believed that we had to get rid of nuclear weapons because I wanted my children and now my grandchildren to have a future. But I really didn't know anything about nuclear weapons, and most people don't know anything about nuclear weapons. There are young people today who don't even think we have them anymore. There are young people today who have never heard of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there are so many people who think we need nuclear power because it's clean and it's safe and it's cheap. Too cheap to meter is what they said they were going to give us. Well, we have a mess on our hands. We have a real mess in terms of the nuclear industries. And the Disarm End Wars Committee, of course, has been working for global nuclear abolition for a very long time, but we also are working for abolition of everything nuclear. A couple of years ago, we started a campaign to end the whole nuclear era, to move the money from nuclear weapons and all of everything that's related to it, including nuclear nuclear power, which produces nuclear weapons grade uranium and plutonium, to move the money to transforming the arms industries so that they, instead of producing guns and missiles and bombs and who knows what else, the researchers, the scientists, the industrialists, the manufacturers, the people who go and punch and clock in order to feed their kids can be making carbon-free, nuclear-free energy systems, for example. And we can wean ourselves from the oil, and the gas, and the coal, and of course the nuclear power. And there's been a bill introduced into Congress asking for just this since 1994 as a result of a voter initiative that us hippies brought to the people of Washington, D.C., or should I say we hippies, brought to the people of Washington, D.C. in 1993 and won the election, much to the surprise of everybody. And Eleanor Holmes Norton of D.C. has introduced a bill into the U.S. Congress every session since 1994 up until the last session, called the Nuclear Weapons Abolition and Economic and Energy Conversion Act. She has not introduced it again this session, but in my tour around the country was to seek co-sponsors for her bill again this session. And we got some, and Chicago, Jan Schakowsky is one of the and Raul Grijalva, who is co-chair of the Progressive Caucus and from Arizona. Who do we have here from Arizona? Yes, there you are, Barbara. Is he your representative?
No, he represents Tucson, and I'm in Phoenix area.
Uh-huh. Well, he's a good man.
But we work with him.
Yeah, he's a good man. And Lacey Clay of St. Louis, Missouri. Yes, there you are. And he signed on last session, and also Raul Grijalva did. But Jan Schakowsky, this is her first time. I'm really excited about it. So I don't know why Eleanor Holmes Norton was not introduced at this session. I think possibly it's twofold. Possibly it's because she's watching Trump and the Republican Congress and kind of holding back and waiting to see what happens. And the second thing I think is that she feels like I feel that we have to rewrite this bill because now we have a nuclear weapons ban treaty that we can start working on. So that's the good news. We really do have something that we can start working with. And the other good news is that I've been reading that there is, that now solar and wind, both of them, are cheaper than nuclear power and certainly cheaper than carbon fuels. So they can't argue that it doesn't make any economic sense to transform from a carbon and nuclear energy society. And Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill, what it's saying is the United States promises the world that we will get rid of all of our nuclear weapons if everyone else does, and that we'll use that money instead to shut down and clean up the nuclear weapons industries and to transform the arms industries into mass-producing carbon-free, nuclear-free energy, and to earmark the money once those industries are self-sufficient, and they will be quickly, earmark the monies for human needs rather than putting it into weapons and war. And another thing that I've asked for, and I think that this appeals to a world beyond war, is it calls for an end to war and all military operations. Now, I think that's sort of a sticking point within Congress, and that's why we haven't gotten a huge hordes of representatives to sign on, because people can't conceive of a world without war. But in fact, we have to get there, and WILPF knows that, and has known that for a long time. So we're going to be having a workshop tomorrow morning. I believe our workshop is at 11:30. Is that right? No,
I think it's
9:30
9:30.
to 11:30, that's right, 9:30 to 11:30, for the Disarm and Wars Committee. And we're working on a petition to support the nuclear weapons ban treaty. And we're trying to iron out what the language should be. And we feel, the Disarm Committee feels that it's really important to get everybody in WILP involved, if at all possible, in figuring out what this language should be and how we should make this happen, how we should get this out to people. Some people say, oh, well, it's so hard to get signatures on a petition, and then what do you do with it? Well, yeah, but now we have the internet, and now we have social media, and now we have some young people here this weekend, and maybe you'll go to, I think there's a workshop on social media, and I intend to be there for sure, because I do the WILP Facebook page. I also do Nuke News, NUC, on Facebook, and if you want to keep up with what's going on in the world with respect to nuclear everything, that's a good place to go, and I suggest that you go there and also post to it. I'll talk about a lot more than that at the workshop, and you are all invited to join in, and we hope that you will be involved with us in developing our campaign.
The good news is that Nuclear Age Peace Foundation also endorsed the petition. So that's a powerful, powerful organization that is going to come together with us.
Thank you, Ellen. So we do have a few minutes, we can go over a little bit, can we? Is that possible?
Yeah.
If we have the permission of our speakers. So just to say, tomorrow, 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. is Next Steps After Ban the Bomb to Peace and Freedom. You'll find that in your Congress packet, the entire agenda. And tomorrow morning, I'll make a few comments about the agenda. And I wanted to come back to something that Phyllis said about the Martin Luther King's statement about the arc of justice bending. I don't remember the entire history. The arc of history bends toward justice. But tomorrow I'll be just talking very briefly about how the construction of our program will bend us toward peace and freedom. So, questions? Let's see. All right. I saw a hand up back here first.
Speak loudly, please.
Yes? Can you stand up and project?
Yes,
Do we
that's
have a
something I
microphone?
can
Is
do.
there a microphone going around?
It's all right. My name is Mary Olson. I have just a brief comment because I've had the privilege of a front row seat on the ban treaty. And I want everybody in this country to hear and know that the work was based on every bit of work that all of us have done all these years. These are our seeds that are sprouting. They're not someone else's seeds, they're our seeds of peace. And it's a sturdy seedling of hope. And we must all claim it as our own little seedling that if we water it and give it what it needs, it will grow. And not feel like it came out of somewhere that we don't know where it came from. It came from the landmine work, it came from every single moment that WILP ever stood up. And I think we must absolutely embrace it.
And let's not forget that International WILP does have the UNO office, and there we have Peace Women, and we have Reaching Critical Will. And so those two groups, program areas were instrumental in working on this in particular. So thank you for reminding us of that. Michelle?
Yes. Hi. So I'll be quick. I promise you I will not be into this. First of all, just thank everyone for inspiring, encouraging, and educating. And I do want to say that in terms of the leadership position, that I think we're in a season or moment in our history where it's going to require all of us leading. And I'm particularly, especially mindful of a conversation with Black Lives Matter, some of the youth in my state of North Carolina, when there was some desire to see the elders, so to speak, take a back seat, and I remind them that successful movements, whether it was SNCC and the NAACP, requires everyone, and everyone has a role to play, and that the elders know where the landmines are. And I say that in a figurative sense, as well as literally for WILPF. And so I do want us to think about how to continue to lead and to walk side by side, not take the lead, but walk side by side with the other fabulous and necessary movements that are growing. I also want to say, in terms of North Carolina, when a lot of people give Reverend Barber a lot of praise, and rightfully so, because I do think that he is such an awesome and courageous leader. I was the executive director for the NAACP, so I ran the state office, allowing him, freeing him up to be able to go out and do what he was doing in a lot of ways, and also was out there as well. But WILPFers were out there at Moral Mondays, every Moral Monday. The Raging Grannies performed, and before we had Moral Mondays, we had HKOJ, and WILPFers took the lead. They were the first to sign our statement. And then the other thing I wanted to ask Kathy, you said you don't watch TV, but I cut the cable cord and messed around and got Netflix, so I ended up watching Orange is the New Black, and there's a priest on there who was arrested for peaceful protest, and I swear, and I'm like, is that Kathy's story? But I don't know. I just don't know, because I'm new to that. But the other thing I wanted to say, in terms of the coalition, it's so important. What has made North Carolina, I think, very powerful in the way we organize under Reverend Barber's leadership, of course, is what we call this fusion politics and a fusion coalition. And that means that all of us uniting and creating such a powerful bond and force that we weren't able to push back against we were able to push back, but we weren't able to conquer and overcome the actions of our legislative body, our General Assembly, and I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow in Nancy and I workshop or presentation. But what was so powerful, and I don't want us to lose sight, is the cross-section and the forces that lead to war globally are the same things that many of us in my community, African American heritage, have fought against within the United States. And so we can't miss those connections. Water, access to water, being terrorized in your home, running out to save your kids. When you were speaking, Kathy, about the Yemen woman, I'm thinking about stories that my great-grandmother told me of her living through Jim Crow and having to hide great uncles and so forth from white men who were coming, and the women lining up with the shotguns in their hands and the Bibles in their laps saying, you know, before you cross over this threshold to drag a man out, we will die fighting you. And so, I mean, so there's so many cross connections, and I think that's where we need to begin to build, to continue to build from as well, is looking domestically at the terror that has been inflicted, as you all pointed out here in America, that has caused our folk within America to go abroad and create chaos and utter terror, because it worked here, and so they were equipped to do that.
So the word that's been adopted by Reverend Barber and the Moral Majority Movement in North Carolina is fusion products, Moral Mondays. Yeah, is fusion movement building. So that may be as compelling a descriptive as intersectionality. We can talk about that. Was there somebody else in this section? Yes, Nancy? I mean, Barbara? Sorry.
I think Phyllis gave us a great challenge, that last 5 minutes. I would really like to see us during this weekend reflect more on how we make a transition, passing on what we know, but allowing younger people to take the lead more than we have been doing in the past. I think it's way past time. Our tiny little main branch just sent a mailing, we sent it by mail, to all of our supporters saying, we need to step back. We need to find out where the young people are organizing and be there and support them and let them mentor us. So I think it doesn't take anything away from our history to say, and now it's somebody else who's going to come to the forefront, and it's not going to be us. Could you say anything more about that?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I think that is a very important point, but I think we also have to see this, to use an old term, as a dialectical relationship. There's something that the great civil rights icon, Harry Belafonte, has been working on for some years in his Generations project, which is to say that young people, newer people, new movements stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before. That's a reality. It's also a reality that younger people, newer movements come to their movements with new ideas and fresh approaches and whole new ways of thinking about things that older people and older movements and legacy movements are not always able to absorb. So the two have to come together. And the question is, I think what Michelle said earlier is really crucial. We need to be where there is motion, whether it's the struggle for clean water in Flint or in Gaza, whether it's the struggle against tanks on the street in Ferguson or in Kabul. These are joint struggles that are both domestic and international, that require the legacy movements of those of us who have made the peace movement the focal point of our organizing. And let me just say one thing about class that comes into this. You know, when we look at the history of our movement and say the peace movement has been, you know, white and old and middle class, we have to be careful to be objective about why that is. It's not because we're bad people and no people of color and young people want to be around us. That's not the point. It's when people are facing desperate conditions in their own community, that's going to be the priority of where they put their work, because it's about survival. That's about survival. And so it is going to fall to those people who are a little bit more comfortable, who are not as desperate in their own lives. And in that context, in this country, the intersection of race and class means that middle class people are more likely to be white than people of color are more likely to be middle class. And that's why, historically, the peace movement, the movements that looked abroad first, were people who had the luxury of having that time because they weren't having to fight to survive. Once survival was assured, internationalism can thrive. So it's a very intersectional point when we look at issues of race and class, youth and old. I mean, I think the word that Harry has done has been extraordinary in bringing together, you know, young white coal miners' children from Appalachia with gang kids from California, with Black Lives Matter from New York and Chicago, to say, what do we have in common? And what can some of our legacy movement activists, whether it was from the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and other parts of it, what can we learn from each other? But the bottom line is what you just said is also true. We need to be where they are. Forget about asking people to keep coming to us and then throwing up our hands when they don't. We go to them. That's the first part. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I just have a pet peeve. I want
Will you tell us your name, please?
Joan Brannigan from St. Louis.
Oh, Joan, hi.
I just have a pet peeve that I want to bring up, that old saw of military-industrial complex. Will you please add to that congressional industrial military complex?
Yeah.
Because that's who decides where the money goes.
That's true.
Right, I call it the Military Industrial Media Congressional.
Yes, Delphine. We'll go for another, where's Chris?
Phyllis, you really
Can we just do
struck
5
a
minutes more?
nerve.
Okay. Delphine.
When you mentioned Prince, Eric Prince, the guy who's made billions under Bush, which happens to be the brother of Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education. But he came up with a new scheme that he has submitted recently. And so this is evil upon evil. Of course, if we're going to have war, there'll be trainers. We're not going to use American soldiers, we're going to use Colombian soldiers. And that drives me nuts. And please comment on it. I mean, we've got to stop stomping our feet, calling our Congress people. This has to stop.
Yeah, this is a new plan from Eric Prince and the CEO of DynCorp, the two of the biggest military contractors of the early Iraq era, as it were, who are claiming, they're being quite modest. They're saying, well, we don't know for sure that this will be better, but it seems to be something we should try because we're not doing so well. They're talking particularly about Afghanistan first, and then perhaps Iraq and Syria. So the idea is to go back to the notion of relying on military contractors who would be, they promised they would be Europeans. They'll be white people, so we don't have to worry so much. You know, that was kind of the subtext, the not very subtle subtext of all of this. Of course, it's white South Africans that have been the biggest contingent of their various forces here. But what no one has been able to answer is the question about the money. Why do you think it's going to be any cheaper? They get paid much higher salaries even though they don't get the same kind of benefits. But more problematically, what no one is asking, in Congress at least, is what about accountability? Would those mercenaries, we should call them what they are, would they be accountable under international law, the Geneva Conventions? We know how difficult it is to get our own military to hold its own soldiers accountable to international law, despite the fact that no one disagrees that in theory, they are bound by the Geneva Conventions. Pretty much no one believes that these people would even pay lip service to the Geneva Conventions. There would be no accountability to international humanitarian law, period, full stop. That's the advantage militarily to the US. It's not about money. It's about having soldiers who any of them can do whatever they want to whomever they like with not even the pretense of being held accountable. That's what makes it so difficult.
New Zealand, where women have been voting since 1893, and we've had nuclear-free legislation for 30 years.
Maryland, where?
Maryland, where, yeah. Just a couple of things. I think it's really important that we don't put a huge load on young people because they've inherited what we've left to them, and as we know, the world is becoming a more and more unequal place. And it worries me, the mental health of young people. We've got to support them and we've got to work together without putting too much burden on young people. I just want to know, what is the most successful strategy for ending war that anyone's come across? Like, it's wonderful to hear, especially your work, Kathy. You've put your body on the line, etc. You've gone to jail, etc. Of all the ways of opposing war, has anyone really analysed what is the most successful so far that we can emulate?
It's a tough one.
You know, for many of you in this room in the 80s, you learned Spanish. If you had a vacation time from your job, you took it and went to Central America. If you had an extra room in your home, it became a crash room for an immigrant. When you went to dances, they were salsa dances. When you had social events, you were all wearing fair trade clothing that came from Central America. It was part of your social lives, many of you in this room, to oppose United States intervention in Central America. And I have to say, I was stunned when it became very clear that the United States really was going to intervene in Iraq, and where was the movement? And I think that when we are able to put into our social lives, our cultural lives, and embrace of the priority of trying to stop a war, there's a much greater possibility. So I do think the United States I think the United States would have intervened far more in Central America, but the various strands of peace movement, anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movement, faith-based movements managed to say, no, we're not going to turn away from this. The focus was consistent and it was strong. I do think that the media in this country has been able to eclipse and ignore many important key educational factors. And if people were educated about the United States war making, I don't think that some of these wars would have withstood the light of day.
I want to respond to one aspect of that. I agree with everything Kathy just said. And I would add something else, which is a particular problem I think that we have faced beginning with the first Gulf War in 1991. And that is, unlike Vietnam, Central America, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, all of those so-called small wars in the context of the Cold War. People in this country, there were big peace movements whose main position was get the troops out, get the US out. But within each of them, there was also a core of people whose view was we support the other side. The other side meaning the military side. Unlike in some of the